Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the brain in greater detail. All right, so I briefly introduced a picture of the brain yesterday. Now we're going to be looking into it a little bit more in depth. So here is a picture of the brain, and this nicely shows all of the protective layers that cover your brain inside your skull. So first you have your brain. The first layer is the subarachnoid space, and this is filled with CSF, which is cerebral spinal fluid. And this provides a nice little cushion inside your brain. Little fluid cushion prevents the brain from coming in harder contact with your skull. Since your skull it's hard, it's bone, and it has the potential to, your own skull has the potential to damage your brain if it hits it. So if you were to suffer a traumatic brain injury, if you were to have a concussion, most of the time that's because you have a head injury, and what the head injury does is that you get hit here and it causes the brain to move inside this cerebral spinal fluid, inside the subarachnoid space. And in moving, if depending upon how hard it is, how hard you get hit, it can move and hit the skull, and that can cause brain damage. Mild, of course, you can have a headache, but then more severe, you can have damage to the brain. So on top of this subarachnoid space is, so in addition to the subarachnoid space, the other thing that surrounds your brain is meninges. And these are thin membranes that also provide additional protection in terms of cushion, but they also are able to provide the brain with, the meninges will carry nutrients and help with delivering blood flow. So the first is the pia mater. This is this section right here. It's very, very thin, okay? Then you have the arachnoid membrane, and then you have the dura mater, and then you have the skull. So basically the only thing that's between your brain and your skull is your subarachnoid space, which is the most protective part. And then you have these three meninge layers. So you're going to be learning a lot about the brain in this course, brain and behavior. So a couple of things that you need to know about the brain in order to understand some of the material that you read is how to refer to the various parts of the brain. Okay, so most of the things that we know about the brain, of course, are originally from basic anatomy. So people, early scientists first would examine animal species and then, of course, moved on to humans. So we give multiple pictures of animal species here so you can see how the same terminology maps on. Okay, so when this rostral, dorsal, caudal, ventral, okay, these are all terms that are used to refer to parts of the, to refer to different sections of the brain, or I should almost say directionality. So rostral is kind of stands for beak, and caudal for tail, but these terms would still basically be used to refer to the front of your brain versus the back of your brain, okay? And then you have the ventral, which is the stomach parts, and this would be the bottom of your brain, and you have the dorsal, which refers to the back, and this would basically be the top of your brain. So here you can see, okay, again, the top is dorsal, the bottom is ventral, and then similar to sort of front and back, you have anterior and you have posterior, okay? And rostral and anterior can be used relatively interchangeably, as can caudal and posterior. And largely these terms will be used to saying like, okay, you're talking about the front part of the brain, so you would say the anterior frontal lobe, so that would be the front of the frontal lobe. You would say the rostral portion of the frontal lobe, so this would be the sort of the very most tip of the frontal lobe. And you can also see these same terms here on a dog. Animal brains, as you can sort of read this, animal brains are oriented similarly, but the spinal cord orientations differ. So this can, but they try to keep everything similar primarily to the orientation of the brain, even though the spinal column sort of changes here. Okay, so this will give you, we're continuing on with anatomical orientation. So here, for example, these are the frontal lobes. So this would be the anterior portion of your brain, and this would be the posterior portion of your brain. This would be the dorsal, and this would be the ventral. Okay, caudal would also be here. Excuse me, rostral would be here, and caudal would be back here. Similarly, you can also take, say, within the frontal lobes. So this right here is basically the frontal lobes. You can say, okay, well, you have the anterior portion of your frontal lobes, and you have the posterior portion of your frontal lobes. So basically, it's the back of the frontal lobes. Okay. Here we're also going to see some anatomical orientations. So this here is a coronal section. Okay, so this slices right through, and this you would see the frontal view here. A coronal section is cut into a vertical plane from the crown of the head down, yielding a frontal view of the brain's internal structures. Here you have a horizontal section, and this gives you a cut that falls along the horizon, and it's usually viewed from looking down on the brain up above. And then you have a sagittal section. This is basically goes through the midpoint, and this will tell you what the middle of the brain, basically, if you were to imagine it's split by an arrow in half, and then this would be what the middle looks like. This is your corpus callosum that joins the two halves of the brain. All right. Here's another view of the directional terms that we've already discussed, specifically with regards to the brain. So here we have the anterior, it's in the front, the posterior in the back, and then we have the ventral, okay, which is the bottom, and we have the dorsal, which is the top. Now, in addition to these front and back and top and bottom, we have terms that refer to how where you are in the brain with respect to laterality, or along the sideline. So anything that's medial, that means you're going towards the midline, okay? So anything going towards the middle. You'd be moving in this direction, towards the middle of the brain, if you follow my cursor. Anything that is lateral, okay, is moving away, is moving more towards the outside. So middle, medial, midline, lateral, outside. So you can use the sort of terms here, medial, midline, lateral, outside. And this matters in terms of flow of information, and that's what they'll be talking about a lot. They'll have pathways that we'll be talking about in terms of the flow of information. You can have a dorsal pathway, you can have a ventral pathway, you can have a pathway that moves out more laterally. So this is one of the reasons why you're going to need to understand these visual, the names that correspond to where the directionality of information within the brain. Because it doesn't necessarily just refer to structure, it can also refer to the flow of information, or a pathway between, or a connection between regions of the brain. All right, so here we're going to be going over some of the various regions of the brain. So I talked about the directionality, the front of the brain, the back of the brain, but there are lobes of the brain. And we show here sort of a labeled, and then you can see here this is a post-mortem brain, and this is not what your brain looks like while it's in your head. Okay, this is after it's been in formaldehyde and that's sort of solidified. While it's inside you, it's a lot more squidgy. So we have the frontal lobes here, and this is all of this. And you can see even in this what looks like a large fissure, okay? Probably right in here. It's kind of hard to tell because sometimes you have stuff that's post-mortem. But right in here, this looks to be the central sulcus that travels all the way laterally on the lateral outside, all the way to the medial, and then back out again. Everything in front of the central sulcus is the frontal lobes. Okay. Behind the central sulcus is the parietal lobes, and then at the very bottom, sort of very caudal or posterior portion of the brain is your occipital lobes. Okay, so here you can see the underside of the brain. So you flip the brain over, you can again see the frontal lobes here. Okay, and then you have these regions called the temporal lobes, and this is these areas right in here. They're a little harder to see in this, and but they're kind of like, they sort of fold in front and sort of fold around and underneath, I should say. And the temporal lobes, you have them on both sides. This very large area down here is your cerebellum, and then you can see your brain stem right in here, right in there. You can almost see the brain stem a little bit easier here. And this is where you have all of your vital functions. Okay. This is a side view where you can see everything and how it fits together. Okay. So this portion, this part of the front of the brain, your frontal lobes would be, maybe you guys are hopefully saying this to yourself, this would be the anterior portion of the brain, and this would be the posterior portion of the brain. This would be the dorsal portion, and this would be the ventral portion. But now you can see all of the four, well, sort of five if you include the cerebellum. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and then you have the cerebellum. This is the midline view, and here you can see your central sulcus that combines them. And this is sort of the inside of the temporal lobe. One of the best ways to remember the orientation of the brain is to make a little fist. And of course it's sort of, this one's pointing to me. If you make your little fist, okay, then you have your temporal lobes here, okay, that's your thumb, your knuckles at the parietal lobe, your fingers here are the frontal lobe, and your occipital lobe would be more towards the wrist. So this can be a good way to try to remember it.